Hi, everyone. My name's Chris Stark. I'm the Chief Executive of the UK's Climate Change Committee. We're the advisors established under the Climate Change Act at UK level and the Scottish Climate Change Act, here to give independent advice on how we tackle climate change in this country. I'm so delighted to be with you this morning, albeit virtually. We are, I'm afraid, stuck still in our home working, and I haven't been able to do any physical meetings now for approaching a year. I'm sure many of you are feeling the same way about it. But we seem to have accommodated it, and I'm so pleased that you are meeting today to talk about the climate strategy for South Lanarkshire. There is so much that can be done at that level, and I'm so pleased that it is being discussed, and I really want to help with that today. So I'm going to take you through, over the next 10 minutes, just a few slides to get you started, hopefully inspire you to think about what we can do in South Lanarkshire to tackle this climate emergency. And let me just begin by saying that I'm particularly pleased because I'm speaking to you today from Glasgow, so just along the road. And of course, in Glasgow at the end of this year, we will be hosting world leaders for the next major climate summit. And it is amazing that we're able to do that. So I really hope come November that we'll be modeling the kind of plans and changes that the rest of the world needs to undertake if we're going to tackle this problem of climate change properly. And at the heart of it is this issue of net zero greenhouse gas emissions, which has become over the last 2 or 3 years something that only people in climate circles talked about, to being almost a kind of binding slogan or mission, which is wonderful to be able to say. And that is exactly how I think we should treat it. This is the challenge of the next 20 to 30 years of getting our economy to carbon neutrality, and thus ending the direct contribution that we have to the problem of climate change through the emissions that we are creating here in Scotland and in the UK. And it's hugely exciting to think about all the changes that we need to make to get to net zero. I believe there will be positive changes for society and for the economy, worthwhile, not just because they will help with climate change, but because they will help with that green recovery that many people now are talking about. This is going to be, as I gather, the fourth Sustainable Development and Climate Change Strategy that South Lanarkshire has produced. That's brilliant. So I really hope I can help make this the best of the four, and the one that will really point us towards the goals in 2030 that we have to really think about. The next decade is the critical decade of action. There's a huge wealth of material that my organisation has published on the transition, on the changes that the UK and Scotland will need to make. If you're at all interested in that, please go to our website and do take a look. But let's get started on this story. But let's start with just a little bit of history, because I always think that helps frame up why we're doing this and why it's important. And if I can start with this chart, and I love this chart because I don't know of a better one to explain the quite astonishing changes that are happening around us in the atmosphere that we breathe and that is around this planet right now. There is one bit of science, and only one bit of science, that I'll talk about in this talk at least, and that is that the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is an almost linear relationship, has an almost linear relationship with the temperature on the planet. So the more carbon dioxide there is in our atmosphere, the more that it acts as a blanket, storing the sun's heat energy. And helpfully, we have a brilliant record of that carbon dioxide, because we can take an ice core from one of the poles on the planet, and we can look at the bubbles. And this is a record of 800,000 years of carbon dioxide concentration from Antarctica. And more recently, you'll see what's been happening. And over that 800,000 year, you can see the 800,000 year history, you can see how carbon dioxide goes in this natural cycle over time. And I just roll forward to what we've done since discovering fossil fuels and since using fossil fuels to fuel the global economy. That line on that chart shows you that we are now way over anything that we've seen in the last million years when it comes to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, now over 400 parts per million. And go back to what I said earlier, that has a direct link to the temperature on the planet. So contained within that line is not the edge of the chart, that's the trend on the graph, that's actual data. That is the record of the modern economy that you see in that black line. This astonishing shift in carbon dioxide concentration, which has come from digging up all the fossils that have been laid down over millions of years in the geology of this planet, using them in our energy processes to fuel the modern economy, all the transport needs that we have, all the energy needs that we have. But we've been producing that carbon dioxide, and there is a penalty. And you're starting to now really see the impacts of that in the changes that we're seeing around us in the global climate. Heat waves happening more and more frequently with more ferocity, more extreme weather, rising sea levels. I'm afraid we're going to see more of that, at least until we arrest the decline in our climate by tackling this issue of greenhouse gas emissions, and especially by reducing our use of fossil fuels. And this chart really shows you what has to happen at the global level. This is what we need to be discussing in the climate change talks in Glasgow in November with world leaders. This is the challenge of net zero globally. What you can see here is the historical position with global emissions in black, and then the red and the blue lines pointing towards the temperature goals that are contained in what's called the Paris Agreement, the thing that was signed by every world leader 5 years ago in Paris. And that's what we'll be discussing in Glasgow, is how we get to those temperature goals. And what you can see here is the median of the emissions pathways, as we call them, the global emissions story that needs to play out over the next 30, 40, and 50 years to get to the point where we can keep temperature rises to well below 2 degrees centigrade, and hopefully with best efforts to get to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So that temperature threshold, if I told you that today we are just over 1 degree of warming, 1 degree centigrade of warming since the Industrial Revolution, when we really started using fossil fuels. What this chart shows you is we have to pull about this kind of handbrake turn in the way that the world is using fossil fuels and then the emissions that the world is responsible for if we're to meet the Paris goals. That needs to play out as a sharp fall in emissions over the 2030s and 40s. And we need to get to net zero globally, probably sometime in the 2070s. But the targets that we have here in the UK are quicker than that. The targets in Scotland quicker still. Net zero by 2050 is the goal for the whole of the UK, and 2045 for Scotland. And those two targets are perfectly wedded together. If the UK is to meet its 2050 goal, then Scotland has to meet its 2045 goal, because it has a greater opportunity to store emissions in the natural world and through some of the technologies that Scotland can develop to capture carbon. So that's the global story. What does that imply for the UK? This has really been the bread and butter of our work most recently in the Climate Change Committee. This is the chart that shows you what we advised just before Christmas the UK should try and achieve over the next 30 years. And the story here is that we overall have been doing a remarkable job of cutting emissions. We measure everything on the 1990 basis. And here in Scotland, we've more than halved emissions on that basis, probably today. To get to net zero, what you can see is that purple line on this chart, which looks like an inverted S, if I can put it like that. It may look like that on your screen, but an inverted S, which is a really interesting kind of take on the story overall for UK emissions. The start of that S is actually quite a plateau in emission reduction, and that's because we are shortly going to run out of road on what's been a very successful strategy for the UK of closing coal-fired power stations. Now, we haven't got many more of them to close, and Scotland has already closed all of its coal-fired power. Still got a bit more of that to do, but the initial plateau is we haven't been doing enough of the other stuff, the cutting emissions in transport and industry, crucially from buildings and from agriculture. That takes time, so we've got to scale up our ambition to cut those things, and then we get the payoff over the 2030s, that very sharp emissions reduction. And that amounts to the requirement to cut emissions across the whole of the UK by about 80% by the mid-2030s, which just a few years ago was the 2050 goal. So that's a measure of the ambition that we now recommend for the UK and for Scotland. If I just roll on to show you a bit more about what would achieve that kind of ambition, this is what we call the emissions abatement chart, sometimes called the rainbow chart when we talk about it in the CCEC in my organization. And broadly what you see in this chart is that there are 4 things that we need to do if we're going to meet net zero. First of all, we have to reduce our demand for fossil fuels, those energy intensive things that use lots of fossil fuels and create lots of greenhouse gases. So that might be things like flying, could even be things like diets, changing the things that we eat, because some of the farm animals that are responsible for many of the methane emissions are cows and sheep. It's also, though, much greater efficiency in our use of energy. And hopefully you can see that those two purpley wedges at the top of this chart point the way, particularly over the short term, to rapid emissions reduction. So we're relying a lot on demand reduction and energy efficiency in the short term, less so in the long term. The big part of this chart, the big chunk in emissions that we see is necessary for the UK to get to its goals, comes from number 2 on this chart. That's the orange, the red and the yellow. That's the take up of low carbon solutions. This is the electric cars. This is the heat pumps that we were using in buildings as opposed to gas boilers. It's carbon capture in industry. And it's also using potentially hydrogen as a new energy source, one that doesn't cause those greenhouse gas emissions at the point of using hydrogen in the energy system. Thirdly, in blue, we've got to finish the job of decarbonising our power system, also developing new ways of generating hydrogen. And fourthly, really importantly, it's not just an energy story. The green wedge that you see on this chart is the things that we need to do in the natural world, the offsetting things that store carbon in the natural world. And Scotland has a huge potential to do that. So restoring peatland, growing trees to store carbon. These are new industries themselves. When you combine all of that together, those 4 elements, demand reduction, taking up low carbon solutions, expanding low carbon energy, and offsetting emissions within the natural world, we get to net zero. And broadly, in your locale, where you live, you too can play with those 4 things to think about what role you have in fueling this transition to zero carbon, which we all need to go on. It's hugely exciting to think about that. And just one more take on the kind of helicopter view, really. One thing we did recently was just step back and say, well, how much of this is due to technological change? And how much of this involves behavioral change? And really interestingly, if you just look at the emissions that we are projecting that we need to save over the next 15 years in this country, about 2/5 of them involve what you might think of as a pure technology change. So a classic example would be closing a power plant. Things that tend to be quite centrally controlled, big policies often set in London or Edinburgh control those technological shifts, fuel switching, those kind of big changes. The rest of it involves behavior change, or you might say societal change. So more than half of the emissions reductions that lie ahead over the next 15 years involve either directly change of behavior, so thinking about perhaps flying less or changing our diet. That's the orange wedge that you see there on this pie chart. And another 2/5 of it involves a combination of new technologies and changing behavior. Classic example is driving an electric car rather than a petrol car, which means you have to plug it in rather than take it to the petrol station. Very exciting to think about those changes because they're really now upon us. We think that by 2030 or thereabouts, in most areas of our economy, we need to get to the point where we have stopped selling high carbon assets and we have started moving progressively and selling only zero carbon assets. So think about the path over the next 10 years to the point by 2030 where we've phased out entirely the sale of petrol and diesel cars, and think about the changes that will go with that. None of them are scary, I think, as long as we plan well for them. But this is going to be the decade of action, and South Lanarkshire's plan over that decade is absolutely critical. Now, all of this takes investment. So I did want to just talk about that. We've done some work, again, at UK level to work out what the size of the investment to deliver that outcome would be. So we now have this detailed plan that takes us all the way to the mid-century and net zero. And that allows us to say that in the UK as a whole, we need to scale up investment to the tune of about £50 billion per year. And that's paying for all that new technology. It's paying for all the changes that we see in the energy networks, all the electric cars, all the new wind farms. That delivers us net zero. It also delivers quite a spike in investment as in the round as a whole. And of course, that is good for the economy as we come out of a deep recession. So that size of increase in investment, which is about increasing total investment by about an eighth in any 1 year, buys you net zero, but it also buys you something else, which is the other exciting part of the most recent analysis that we've done. It buys you a saving. The consumer saves money from these more efficient devices, the cars, the heat pumps, that are now causing us to move away from fossil fuels onto something better than that, something cleaner than that. And of course, it means that we're not spending money on fossil fuels themselves. And there's a saving to that that builds up over time. And this is what's so exciting, is that we can see that the saving over time cancels out the investment costs entirely, which means that overall, the transition becomes cheaper and cheaper over time. Now, exciting to be able to explain that, of course, at the high level, but that means that we have to think very clearly about what we do to make sure that those consumers who are most vulnerable, be they businesses or people, are shielded from some of those real costs, especially in the early part of the transition. And we need to think carefully about the way to achieve what we call a just transition, a fair transition over that period, knowing that the overall cost in aggregate may be low, doesn't hide the fact that in some parts of society there are some big costs, in particular those costs of how we get to decarbonize our buildings. Low carbon buildings that are more energy efficient in the long run tends to involve us spending money in the short term. And we need to do that in the knowledge that we have to protect those people who can't afford it from the cost of that transition. But overall, I think it's a really positive story. And especially when you think about that investment challenge as we come out of the recession following the pandemic, as being a really important prop to the economy as we face up to the next decade. Now we have those numbers from Scotland too. And in Scotland, low carbon capital investment needs to scale up to the order of about £5 to £6 billion per year by 2030. So just think about that. That's £5 to £6 billion that's being spent here in Scotland that we wouldn't otherwise be spending. Hugely important to do that. It's spread quite evenly across the various sectors of the Scottish economy. A lot of money being spent, of course, in renewable electricity, but also a lot of money being spent on the costs of on the investment rather that's required for the electric vehicle transition, also in industry. So a whole host of areas where we can see that investment requirement. But the one I really want to pull out, which you can hopefully see on this chart, is the requirement to invest in our buildings. Our buildings, our commercial buildings, and also crucially the buildings that we live in. There is a big investment requirement for that. That is where I hope the local jobs will be. And this is an investment that we're going to have to make right across the UK and in South Lanarkshire as well. So we need armies of people retrofitting buildings, making them less drafty, making them ready for the low carbon heat supply that we'll have over the late 2020s and 30s, I hope. That is a major task, and it requires the people of South Lanarkshire to come together and decide what they want, I think, to get involved in that process and to embrace the fact that there's going to be lots of new employment opportunities over that transition. That investment, as I mentioned before, is really good as we come out of a pandemic. We're using what we might have previously thought of as spare capacity in the economy for a really good purpose. But we can't hide from the fact that there will be some sectors that also shrink over that transition. And of course, the crucial thing in all of this is we've got to prepare for that, especially preparing for the jobs and the skills requirement that goes with all of these changes and investments that we're talking about today. I am personally hugely excited about it. Again, this is the decade when we will make our plans and hopefully execute them to deliver this level of investment and get us to net zero by 2045 in Scotland. It's £5 to £6 billion per year. So the last thing I just want to say today, and I'm sorry I can't be with you for longer, is just something briefly on the role of local authorities on that transition. And this is something that we in the Climate Change Committee have been thinking a lot about recently. We are naturally focused, of course, on the national story, on the international science. But in my former job, I worked in the Scottish Government where I was the Director for Energy and Climate Change. And I spent a long time in Scotland, in the Scottish Government, thinking a lot about what we do with Scotland's 32 local authorities to make this real, to make it happen. We know that across the UK, there are over 300 local authorities now have declared climate emergencies. A third have strategies and action plans to deliver on the very ambitious targets, including South Lanarkshire. But most of them very few in fact, have really made the leap to what I would call a fully fledged strategy that is wedded to the national strategies we have at Scottish level and UK level. And that's really important. We're going to have to bridge that divide and make this work. So I really hope that in terms of what you are discussing, you can think about that more integrated strategy for South Lanarkshire that fits well with what the Scottish Government is planning and some of the big changes, particularly in energy, that are coming from UK-wide policies that will be made over the course of the next few months. It's really important because more than half of the emission cuts that we need rely on, as I mentioned, people and businesses taking up those low carbon solutions I talked about a few minutes ago. And those are decisions that are going to be made at local and individual level. Many of those decisions are going to depend on having a supporting infrastructure, supporting systems in place in South Lanarkshire. And if we get this right, then we can get to the point where we are tackling what we estimate to be approximately a third of emissions that are either directly or indirectly influenced by what local authorities, including South Lanarkshire, can do. Now, I'm a big fan of these top-down policies, as you'd expect, because I think a lot about top-down policies, especially energy policies, but they only go so far. So unless we've got the local capacity to embrace this and to deliver it, then it's not going to work. So you see on this slide, I hope that we've framed up what we call the 4 Fs, which I won't go through today, but they're a good framework to think about having a good plan for tackling emissions and indeed climate change itself at local authority level. I'm not going to try today to prescribe the changes to you because you will know much better than me what must be done in South Lanarkshire, but I would encourage you to think about how the local authority can directly control and how perhaps it can directly influence the emissions in South Lanarkshire itself. So there's firstly the direct things, the things that the local authority is responsible for, the buildings, the operations of the local authority, there's travel policies as well. So that's an obvious thing to get right. Secondly, there's the procurement strategy as well for the local authority. So that's a huge opportunity there to do the right thing and to cut emissions throughout the supply chain. And that will be a supply chain that is local to South Lanarkshire. That can make an enormous difference. For me, the biggest thing that can be done is to shape the place, if I can put it that way, place shaping as it's sometimes called. So I think this is the biggest lever, the one that's least explored and therefore the most exciting opportunity. This is the powers that local authorities have over new development and transport, especially. It's the need to plan, especially for this challenge of retrofitting buildings and the decarbonisation of heat to those buildings. I mentioned that a few times today, but for me, that's exciting because that's also where the local employment will lie. So that's a creator of local employment over the next 10 years and more. The Scottish Government's already got ambitious plans for climate change, and South Lanarkshire, I hope, is going to be at the front of the queue for rolling out some of the things that are promised by Scottish ministers. But that's really going to be a story about innovation. So that's another area where I think South Lanarkshire can excel, innovating, demonstrating best practice, of course, not just in South Lanarkshire, but for the whole of Scotland. So being a case study for how to do this is really the goal, I think, here. Nearly coming to the end of my list of things that you can think about today, but the partnerships that you can establish are also really important. The ability to convene a meaningful discussion about what we can change in South Lanarkshire and how that can help address the climate crisis and the climate risks that we face is absolutely critical. And lastly, there is an essential job, which I would suggest cannot be done by any other group or body, to involve local groups, to engage local people, to communicate and raise awareness of local solutions in South Lanarkshire, the kind of things that will really move us with more speed towards net zero and towards tackling climate change. So I hope, in summary, that South Lanarkshire can model the change that we need to see, to be a kind of beacon of best practice, and to fit as best that you can with what is, I accept, a very rapidly changing circumstance when it comes to the commercial and policy changes all around us around net zero, which will change rapidly over the course of the next few years. But framing up a strategy, especially for 2030 and the next decade, in amongst all this very positive change in the year when Scotland will host world leaders for the next major climate summit, is one of the most exciting things that I think anyone can be involved with. And I really, really wish you well with it. So from me, I just wanted to say, please get in touch if there's anything that you feel that we can explain more. And please have a look at the things that we have produced on our website. And please get in touch with me too. I'm really pleased to speak. I wish you well, and I'll see you soon.